Volunteers are using these shells to build reefs that will help new oysters grow in low-country waterways.
Florida dumped 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico, and what formed on that seafloor afterward left scientists struggling to explain what they were looking at. These weren't precision-placed materials guided by sophisticated engineering. They were leftovers, scraped off dinner plates, shoveled out of seafood processing plants, loaded onto barges, and tipped into open water between 2007 and 2024. Nobody expected anything extraordinary. Critics called it ocean dumping, dressed up as conservation. Fishermen feared it would smother whatever fragile life still clung to Florida's struggling coastal floor. Even the scientists running the program braced for failure. But something happened on that Gulf seafloor that violated every expectation, every timeline, and every assumption the data supported. A dead stretch of ocean bottom began transforming into something alive, faster, denser, and more biologically complex than anything the models predicted. What formed down there wasn't just a reef. It was a self-expanding system still growing today. And exactly how it happened will change the way you think about what the ocean is capable of doing with almost nothing. The experiment nobody believed would work. Between 2007 and 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission ran one of the most contested coastal restoration experiments in state history. The premise was almost absurdly straightforward. Collect discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processing facilities across Florida. Load them onto barges. Dump them into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key, a small fishing community that had watched its surrounding waters degrade for decades. Over the course of the program, the total deposit would reach more than 500,000 tons. The opposition was immediate and serious. Environmental groups framed it as ocean dumping disguised as conservation, warning the shells would smother whatever fragile life remained on the soft, sandy bottom. Local fishermen feared sediment disruption, altered currents, and permanent destruction of fishing grounds their families had relied on for a century. The criticism wasn't fringe, it was technically grounded and backed by legitimate ecological concern. What added weight to those concerns was historical context. By some estimates, the United States had lost approximately 85% of its historic oyster reef habitat by the early 2000s, a collapse driven by overharvesting, coastal development, nutrient pollution, and the removal of shell material that reefs need to sustain themselves. When harvest operations removed oysters without returning the shell, they were pulling out the very substrate the next generation needed to survive. The cycle broke quietly over decades, leaving the Gulf floor a soft, featureless expanse that supported almost nothing. The Commission's logic for pressing forward was stark. These shells were headed for landfills anyway. If there was any chance they could function as reef substrate, the experiment was worth running. Nobody, including the scientists who designed it, expected it to work this fast. When the first monitoring teams returned 18 months after the initial shell drops, they were braced for poor results. What they found instead stopped the team mid-debrief. Dr. Krimsky, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, paused mid-sentence when the monitoring data appeared. Life was colonizing the shell mounds, not on the standard 2 to 3 year timeline that any artificial reef project requires. In months, clusters of marine organisms were forming at rates with no precedent in the scientific literature. The shells weren't acting as passive debris. They were functioning as biological triggers, and nobody could fully explain the speed of what was unfolding. The invisible phase, microlife that rebuilt an ecosystem. The first colonizers weren't fish. They weren't oysters. They were bacteria. Within days of the shells settling onto the seafloor, microscopic bacterial communities began colonizing the calcium carbonate surfaces, forming thin biofilms, structured living layers that transformed dead shell into functional microhabitat. These weren't random microbial patches. They were organized biological infrastructure laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. And the shells themselves were doing something nobody had fully anticipated. Oyster shells are composed primarily of aragonite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate that dissolves slowly in seawater. As those shells released calcium ions, they created localized alkaline microzones in the surrounding water. Tiny chemical environments where pH was slightly elevated compared to ambient conditions. Those shifts were precisely what calcifying organisms need. Barnacles, tube worms, and juvenile oysters require specific chemical conditions to initiate shell formation. The deposited shells were manufacturing those conditions, engineering the chemical prerequisites for their own colonization. Sandy seabeds cannot initiate this cascade. Sand offers no attachment surface, no chemical microzones, no structural complexity for biofilm formation. The soft-bottom Gulf floor was biologically trapped. The conditions for reef initiation simply didn't exist, and nothing in the ecosystem had a mechanism to create them from scratch. The shell deposits bypassed that trap entirely. Weeks after the shells hit the bottom, diatoms and microalgae moved into the established biofilms, creating the foundation of a rudimentary food web. Microscopic crustaceans and larval mollusks followed. Those grazers drew the first juvenile fish. Each stage fed the next, a self-reinforcing biological loop constructing itself invisibly from discarded seafood waste. By the end of the first 6 months, shell surfaces were coated in layered biofilm and microalgae. To a casual observer, the sites still looked like failure. But Dr. Krimsky's water samples and sediment cores told a completely different story. In less time than a traditional artificial reef shows any biological response at all, the shell deposits had established a complete microscopic ecosystem. The invisible phase was the hidden scaffolding. Without the bacteria, without the aragonite chemistry, without the biofilm feeding the first grazers, none of what followed would have been possible. The return of the reef builders. Oysters require hard surfaces to survive. That single constraint had been quietly strangling Florida's Gulf Coast for decades. Oyster larvae, called spat, drift through coastal currents searching for substrate. In a healthy reef system, that substrate is the accumulated shell of previous generations, centuries of dead oyster layered into a hard, complex platform filtering water, dissipating wave energy, and providing habitat for an estimated 300 associated species. But Florida's natural reefs had been systematically dismantled. By the early 2000s, oyster larvae were drifting through open water, with almost nowhere to land. The reproductive cycle had broken, and the Gulf had no natural mechanism to repair itself. Because the shell material needed to restart the cycle was being removed faster than it could accumulate. The deposited shells solved this bottleneck almost immediately. Each shell pile was a concentrated landing zone positioned where Gulf currents carried drifting spat. Within the first year, University of Florida Marine Lab researcher Dr. Bill Pine documented juvenile oyster settlement in numbers that significantly exceeded projections. By year 2, those juveniles had matured into reproductive adults producing larvae of their own, adding a second biological generation to the reef architecture. Human hands had created the initial conditions. Nature had taken over completely. By year 3, monitoring surveys recorded an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shells. Nearby soft-bottom areas with no substrate supported virtually none, and the growth wasn't contained to the original deposition footprint. Oysters were dying, contributing shell, and providing substrate for the next wave. The reef was building itself vertically and expanding horizontally without any additional human input. Then came the moment that reframed the entire public conversation. Charter Captain Mike Lenz had been one of the loudest opponents of the shell deposition program from its inception. He had testified against it formally. He had warned it would destroy fishing grounds his family had worked for 3 generations. In 2013, standing at the rail of his boat over an established reef site, he watched a school of redfish holding in the current around a shell mound and said something he had never planned to say. He had been wrong. He had never seen fish stack up like that in 25 years on those waters. That reversal wasn't simply one man reconsidering his position. It was the moment the scientific case and the lived experience of the Gulf Coast fishing community finally aligned. And the fish were only the beginning. When the fish arrived, everything changed. Reef fish don't wait for formal invitations. The moment structural complexity appears on a featureless seafloor, they find it. Within 2 years of the Cedar Key reefs establishing themselves, fish surveys were returning numbers that made Dr. Pine's team recheck their methodology before publishing. Biomass around the reef sites had increased by more than 340% compared to control areas. Species diversity was up 280%. And critically, juvenile fish counts, animals born in those waters and surviving to maturity there, were the primary driver of the numbers. The reefs were producing fish, not concentrating existing populations, producing new ones. That distinction matters enormously. Sunken ships and concrete reef balls are well documented for now, aggregating fish that already exist nearby, redistributing a fixed population around a new landmark. Survey numbers can look dramatic without representing any genuine increase in marine biomass. Fisheries managers had learned to treat aggregation effects with skepticism. The Cedar Key reefs were doing something genuinely different. The underlying biology, reproduction, juvenile survival, trophic feeding, was operating at a level that concrete and steel simply cannot replicate, because inert structures don't filter water, don't produce chemical microzones, and don't generate the invertebrate communities that form the base of a productive food web. Redfish arrived first. Sheepshead followed. Flounder worked the reef edges. Snook appeared in numbers not seen in those waters in years. Charter operators across Cedar Key formally requested new reef sites from the same commission they had fought against 6 years earlier. Hotels, bait shops, and waterfront restaurants all reported measurable revenue growth tied directly to the marine resurgence around the reef sites. The ecological cascade continued upward. Octopuses established territories in structural gaps. Sea turtles reappeared, foraging on invertebrate-rich surfaces. Dolphins were documented hunting systematically along reef edges. Each new arrival reinforced the food web beneath it. The system was growing more complex and more resilient with every passing season. But fish were only part of what was changing. Something else was happening to the water itself, something nobody had specifically predicted, with consequences reaching far beyond the reef boundaries. The billion-gallon cleaning machines. One adult oyster filters between 30 and 50 gallons of seawater every single day. Run that number across hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving on restored reef structures. Entire reef systems were now processing billions of gallons of Gulf water daily, extracting suspended particles, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff from the water column. No machinery, no electricity, no maintenance cost. Nature had constructed an industrial-scale water treatment system out of discarded restaurant waste. The Gulf Coast carries a chronic nutrient pollution problem. Nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural operations and urban development pour into coastal waters continuously, fueling harmful algal blooms that cloud the water, deplete dissolved oxygen, and periodically trigger mass fish kills. Red tide events, blooms of the toxic Alga Carenia brevis, had become a defining and devastating feature of Florida's Gulf Coast. The oyster reefs were attacking that problem at its biological source. A 2015 study published in Estuaries and Coasts estimated that a single acre of healthy oyster reef can remove up to 38 pounds of nitrogen annually through direct filtration and nutrient sequestration. Scaled across the Cedar Key restoration footprint, the contribution was becoming ecologically significant. Water clarity around the reef sites began improving measurably within a few years. Dissolved oxygen levels rose, nutrient concentrations dropped, and the improvements weren't staying local. They radiated outward, affecting surrounding waters across a growing radius. Clearer water let sunlight penetrate deeper. Seagrass, critical nursery habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, began expanding into zones that had been too murky to support it for years. Seagrass then stabilized sediment, which reduced turbidity further, which enabled more seagrass growth. A second self-reinforcing feedback loop triggered by the first. The results didn't stay in Florida. Alabama launched its own shell recycling program by 2015. Mississippi followed. Louisiana initiated large-scale reef-building initiatives. The Billion Oyster Project adopted the same principle in New York Harbor. The concept had a name researchers began using with increasing frequency: circular environmental design, the idea that materials once categorized as waste could be systematically repurposed as functional ecological infrastructure. But there was one test still ahead. One nobody had designed. One that would arrive without warning. The hurricane test, nobody planned. September 2017. Hurricane Irma. Category 4. Wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour. Catastrophic storm surge. Waves striking the Gulf Coast with enough force to strip beaches and reshape shorelines overnight. When damage assessment teams moved through the Cedar Key area after Irma passed, they found something that stopped the conversation cold. Shorelines backed by the restored oyster reefs had experienced dramatically less erosion than unprotected stretches immediately adjacent. On average, 30 to 40% less than nearby soft sand beaches. The reefs had functioned as natural wave attenuators, their dense, irregular, three-dimensional structure absorbing and dissipating wave energy before it reached the shoreline. At full force. Engineers estimated the reefs had prevented approximately $3 million in coastal property damage during Irma alone. The total cost of the entire 15-year restoration program had run to approximately $5 million. The reefs had recovered nearly 60% of their program cost in a single storm. But here is what concrete seawalls cannot do. Seawalls crack. Riprap shifts. Steel corrodes. Concrete eventually fails, and when it fails under storm conditions, the failure is often sudden. A 2019 analysis published in Nature Sustainability found that oyster reefs reduce wave energy by an average of 50 to 70% across a range of storm conditions, performance comparable to conventional hard armoring at a fraction of the installation cost and with zero maintenance requirement once the reef is self-sustaining. The oyster reefs operated on a fundamentally different principle. Storm damage triggers new larval settlement. Each subsequent generation adds height and structural complexity. The barrier was growing stronger after every storm, not weaker. Coastal engineers who had dismissed oyster restoration as a fringe conservation project suddenly had no convincing technical argument against it. What had started as a controversial waste disposal strategy had quietly become one of the most cost-effective coastal defense systems ever documented on the American Gulf Coast. The living structures that refused to stay still. By the early 2020s, the Florida reefs had done something no artificial reef in the region had managed. They had grown substantially beyond their original footprint, measurably, documentably, without any additional human input. The oldest deposition sites had roughly doubled in total area since the initial shell drops, expanding outward in every direction through the biological momentum of the oyster reproductive cycle alone. Each generation settled on existing structure, matured, died, contributed shell for the next wave of larvae, vertical accumulation, horizontal spread. The reef was engineering its own expansion without assistance. The structural complexity had transformed dramatically over 15 years. Early deposits were irregular mounds of loose calcium carbonate. The living reefs that emerged were architecturally elaborate, vertical profiles, gaps between dense oyster clusters, overhangs, interlocking surfaces, creating dozens of distinct microhabitats. Crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish were simultaneously exploiting different structural features of the same reef. Not a substrate, an ecosystem. Researchers were also finding evidence of something outside the original program rationale entirely. Dense oyster reefs sequester organic carbon in their shells and surrounding sediments. A 2021 study published in PLOS One estimated oyster reef restoration could sequester between 70 and 200 grams of carbon per square meter per year. Oyster restoration had begun appearing in climate adaptation strategies, not just as habitat recovery and coastal defense, but as a carbon management tool. The ecological case had expanded into a climate case, almost by accident. Biodiversity metrics at the most mature Cedar Key sites were approaching levels recorded at pristine natural limestone reef systems elsewhere in the Gulf. Endangered sea turtles had returned. Dolphins hunted the reef edges systematically. The Gulf was rebuilding itself around the oysters, and the oysters were rebuilding themselves around the Gulf. The long-term trajectory pointed towards something restoration ecologists rarely claim with confidence: a self-sustaining system that no longer requires active human management. The shell deposits of 2007 had seeded a biological cycle now perpetuating itself independently. Each oyster that lived and died contributed substrate for the next generation. Each generation expanded the reef's footprint. Each expansion created new habitat, filtered more water, protected more shoreline, and supported more species. The intervention had ended. The ecosystem had not. 500,000 tons of oyster shells, discarded, written off, tipped into the Gulf of Mexico without any certainty that a single useful thing would result. Critics called it reckless. Fishermen called it a threat. Even the scientists behind it braced for failure. What formed instead was a self-expanding, self-repairing, water-purifying, shoreline-protecting, fish-producing ecosystem, built from what was being sent to the landfill. The question the data is now forcing isn't whether this worked. The question is why it took so long for anyone to try it. Subscribe and check out the next video on your screen, because where oyster restoration goes next is even more extraordinary than what you've just seen. 500,000 tons of shells, discarded, tipped into the Gulf without certainty. Look what formed.